Welcome to the ISSQUARED studios here in Westlake Village, California. I'm Suchinth Kumar, the Chief Revenue Officer of ISSQUARED, and great to have you back. Today, we're going to continue talking about external identities and dive a little deeper, maybe double click into a couple of key concepts on external identities. But before I go any further, I want to introduce our co host for the day. We have a very, very special guest, Neville Mendonça. Neville is a thought leader in the IAG space. I myself have personally worked with Neville for several years on IAG projects, advising a host of different clients on IAG strategy as well as external IAG strategy. But before I go any further, I'm going to hand it over to Neville just to introduce himself for our audiences before we double click. And I think today we have a great session planned. And I'm going to hand it over to Neville Mendonça to introduce himself.
Thank you, Suchinth. I'm Neville Mendonça. I am a senior architect at I Squared. I have 20 years of experience in the IAM domain, mostly focused on identity management and governance aspects of IAM. I've been with I Squared for several years now, and it has been an amazing journey. We have a great team with deep IAM expertise. We have together worked on challenging projects at a number of our customers. This includes big, medium, and small size organizations. We have worked on leading IAM products in the market. We saw the need for an application to manage external identities. This was a niche area, so we started building EIG from the scratch. We have come a long way since then.
Hey Neville, thanks. That's actually a fantastic segue. You mentioned EIAG and external identities. I know, Neville, you've been deeply engaged with the product from its very early days and working very closely with the product management teams. In our last session, Neville, we talked about some of the challenges, and also just to recap for our audiences, we talked about the challenges with managing external identities, namely the speed and the volume and just dealing with that volume of external identities that can become a huge problem. Two, we talked about visibility, the ability to run audits, and the continuous need to make sure that people are being onboarded, offboarded, governance, all that fun stuff. And then lastly, we also talked about the concept of custodians, and that's a critical concept that we have. And like you said, Neville, this is a kind of a niche area, and an area that kind of we came across in our work across a series of different verticals where we saw that companies had to deal with external partner organizations. I know that you've done a lot of work, one in actual real world implementations, and you also advised our product teams on some of the product vision and direction. So, but if we dial it back a bit and take a step back, Neville, how would you go about starting, just not even the tool, just how do you start setting up a company to manage external identities?
Wow. That's a good question, Suchint. So, first of all, start with a high level planning. Identify key people from the business who manage relationships with external partners. Identify the industry verticals that these external partners fall into. Example, sales and distribution, technology, marketing, etc. Then identify the applications, systems, the users from the external organizations need access to. Classify if the access is required for all external identities or if it can be limited to specific verticals or to specific external organizations. Then identify the custodians. So these are your internal users who are responsible to onboard, offboard external users and manage their access. But in certain cases, it can be external users whom you can delegate access to, and I will come to this in a few. Start defining custodians, business processes around access. These can then be applied to all external partners or to specific verticals or to individual external organizations.
So Neville, that was great. So Neville, if I just double click a little more on the organization setup, I think based on what you're saying and kind of based on what we've seen, is it fair to say that organizations who spend, when you're implementing external access, a lot of this is front end design, foundational, the setting up of org structures, for lack of better words, setting up org structures for org design of the external partnerships and a real good business level understanding of the partnerships. Would you agree with that? where tool agnostic. And I know EIG, like I said last time, makes this whole process really elegant and simple. However, it's not really the tool. It is before that. It's the business process analysis. It's really setting it up for future growth, for scalability and visibility. Would you agree on that? And typically, what have you seen in terms of just when you've gone into, let's say, a mid to large size enterprise? How much time has it taken up to set up these external organizations, or is it kind of, does it a first department runs first and then other departments layer on later? Any thoughts on that?
As I said, Suchin, the key is planning and design. Getting together all the internal business users who manage relationships with your external partners. Have workshops to understand the existing processes and then design and document the policies and workflows for EIG. Get a sign off from everyone before even starting with the implementation. Architect the solution so it is robust and scalable.
No, absolutely. I think you bring up a very good point, Neville. And what I've seen, and I think working with you on some of these implementations for external access is, it depends. Like I think in the life sciences industry, it's pretty normal, typical to see like a CROs or clinical research organizations, and in life sciences as well as other industries, to see distributorships. The need for commercial organizations to manage external sales and sales related distribution type of activities and come on board. And typically, there's kind of a rush to get somebody onboarded very quickly. Sometimes the org structures are not set up. Possibly it helps initially, but there's some pain later. And we've been involved in some, let's call it rework or reorg projects, where you kind of have to go back and set up these things. So I totally agree with you on that point on setting up the org structures. Now, diving a little deeper, Neville, into the custodian concept, can you talk a little bit of like typically the role an internal custodian plays? So let's just say company A is setting up EIG or any IAG platform for managing external identities. And you have internal custodians. Is it one per organization? Is it based on volume? And then what's an external custodian for the partner organization? And for the folks, for our audiences who are tuning in this for the first time today, we talked about the whole concept of custodians in the previous session, where the ability to delegate responsibility and accountability for identities, we can make that a lot simpler by assigning custodians. Both from an internal company, and when I say internal company, I'm talking about a company that's trying to manage its external relationships. And then for the external B2B companies, where let's say there's a company A that's setting up a distributorship agreement, and there's a distributor. You have an internal custodian that's handling for company A, and then you have an external custodian that's handling for the distributor. So, Neville, what have you seen in terms of the roles and responsibilities of these custodians, and does this scale? And what's the best guidance you can give on kind of this whole roles of custodians? And you also talked about super custodians. So I guess put a little differently, there were a lot of questions there. To make it simpler, could you just double click a little bit on the roles of custodians and kind of an elegant way of setting them up for scale?
Okay, so let's talk about custodians. In EIG, a custodian is someone who's responsible and accountable for onboarding and offboarding external users. There are three types of custodians with various levels of access. Super custodians. These have access to manage users in all the external organizations that you have. Then you can have custodians for specific organization types. These are custodians to manage specific industry verticals, or as we call in EIG, these are the organization types. And then finally, you can have custodians for individual external organizations. These are custodians defined for a specific external organizations. So now only your internal users can be a super custodians or custodians for the industry verticals. However, for specific external organizations, you can define a custodian who is either an internal user or an external user belonging to that specific organizations. So the number of custodians will be based on the volume of external users who need to be managed. We, however, do have processes for onboarding, offboarding users in bulk.
Neville, thanks. That was a really good and detailed explanation on custodians, but maybe just to kind of correlate it with the slide we showed earlier, let me just share my screen very quickly. And I want to bring up something which shown the audiences last week. This is what I call it's the kind of a spaghetti slide that we have here. So, Neville, the explanation that you gave on the custodians, the super custodians, the internal custodians, and the external custodians, I think that was a great explanation. But let's kind of map it back to this kind of a real world scenario. I think for audiences and Neville, what we see on the screen is fairly typical in large scale organizations, even mid sized organizations, the various types of external relationships. Again, this itself is at a very macro level, and it's fairly typical to find an organization that has these kind of external relationships. And now, not all of these may be automated, not all of these may have people getting onboarded, but it's fairly typical to have these relationships. And while this itself may look like a bit of an eye chart, frankly, the external relationships are sometimes even more complex, or dare I say, convoluted than this. So, Neville, how can you walk us through what you just explained on custodians and how that would apply to something like what's on this slide or this graphic, which is kind of a real world interpretation of what we've seen in several external identity implementations that we've done?
So in this slide, Suchinth, we see the different industry verticals. Example, marketing, sales and distribution, technology, etc. These we map to the organization types in EIG. And then the individual partners are onboarded as external organizations within the respective verticals.
Thanks, Neville. And from what I've seen on this, particular slide that we just went through, what I've seen in practice when we've implemented EIG, the model does scale, and a lot of it has to do. While it does look complex, and admittedly, some of these relationships are complex and convoluted, but once the initial setup happens, it actually moves faster than maybe the diagram leads us to believe. And we've seen some of these implementations scale pretty well. Obviously, the foundations are still very important of understanding the business process and the basics of the training that go into place. So I think that's fantastic. Moving on from kind of the custodian concept, I think we spent a lot of time on custodians because an org structure of how the organizations need to set up, because that's so foundational to having an elegant uh, tool. Now, what I wanted to do, Neville, is move on from maybe custodians and org structures, which are obviously, and the reason we spend a lot of time on this is these are very foundational concepts. But I also wanted to focus on automation and governance, which are also key aspects of managing external identities, as well as the EIAG tool. Let me quickly bring up a slide, a graphic over here, and kind of get your view on this. So, if you look at the graphic that we have on the screen right now, I think the left hand side of it, the simplified process, that's all about setting up the org structure, setting up custodians. That's all about delegating authority, distributing responsibility and accountability to make visibility better, to make accountability better. But let's talk a little bit about automation and governance, which are obviously key concepts of any IAG implementation. But talking about IAG and an external identity context, Neville, uh, can you speak a little bit more on maybe double click a little bit into automation and governance on the EIAG platform?
Okay, so this is a very good question, Suchint. So let's talk about automation first. Just like an identity management tool used to manage internal identities, it's the same concept over here. We automate the user lifecycle and access for external identities. And in the same way, for governance, we can define attestation processes. This can either be continuous processes that run, say, every month or every quarter, every 6 months, every year, whatever the frequency you need it to be, or one off campaigns. Here, you recertify the users. For example, if someone has left their organization and need to be offboarded, and or the access that these users have. For example, someone has moved to a different role and no longer needs access to applications or systems. So this is where you would either offboard users or revoke their access via this certification campaigns.
So thanks for that, Neville. And so, Neville, would it be fair to say then, like a lot of the concepts that we associate with a traditional IAG implementation around governance and automation. Obviously, they apply to external identities, but in a bit of a different context. And what we see here with EIG is the what we've done is we've transposed some of these concepts in a very elegant fashion to handle for external identities. Now, when you come to internal identities, sometimes there's some complex workflows and complex business logic. I think on the external identity side, some of that does exist, but I think the handling of the org structure, the custodians, the delegation of authority. A lot of times, the external access is really focused on very verticalized access. What I mean by that is very specific access and more than role management. While the concept of role management absolutely applies in the external context as well, I think the way to handle companies to assign authority or um, accountability, I think that's very key to that. So thanks for that, Neville. Neville, before we conclude, we talked about last time in the last session, I talked about visibility and the whole concept of having visibility, a single pane of glass for external identities. And it gets very complex depending on the number of organizations, the number of identities. Sometimes you have an organization that you're dealing with, but you've got different contracts and different business arrangements with different parts of one external organization. Now you scale that up. So I've seen companies that have hundreds of external organizations that you deal with. And can you talk a little bit about the visibility to this and the whole aspect of visibility being the ability to respond to maybe audit requests and really from a security standpoint of just having a comprehensive picture of external access into your organization?
EIG lets you define a structure for various external organizations, put them into their industry verticals, and then lets you define custodians and onboard users into their respective organizations. Once you do this, EIG connects to the various applications or systems it manages and aggregates and correlates the accounts and the entitlements these users have. So basically, what you have done is you have all the external users, their accounts, and access correlated in one place. EIG has a state of the art user interface where auditors can log in and view this data. It also has various reports available out of the box. And if required, you can use your favorite reporting tools and create your own reports. All the data resides in a SQL database.
No, thanks, Neville. And that's a great point. And before we conclude the show for today, what I find very fascinating about EIG is the fact that this tool came out of the genesis of the product was really came out of trying to solve very specific customer problems. And what we've seen is over the years is this tool has been built ground up to deal with very specific external identity use cases, as Neville just said. So I think overall, right now it's still a journey. I'm sure there's more aspects that we look at, other use cases as we learn on external identities and as the tool progresses. But foundationally, I think a lot of our clients have had a lot of success with this tool. So Neville, thank you very much. Next time I think we're going to fly you down from Florida, have you here in the studios with us in Los Angeles over here.
Thank you everyone for joining in, and thank you Suchinth for having me on this show. I'm sure we are going to do many more shows in the future. Thank you.
For our audiences, thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate you tuning in and spending your valuable time with the show. I look forward to having you back on the show again. And Neville Mendonça, thank you once again.